The quiet chairman. Calvin Briggs stepped into the plush confines of the Horizon Lounge at JFK International Airport with the unassuming ease of a man who had nothing to prove. At 68, his gait was measured, his bearing upright, his face weathered by time and tempered by experience. He wore a worn brown leather jacket over a clean white polo, dark slacks, and carried only a single scuffed briefcase. Around him, sleek executives in designer suits murmured over cappuccinos, oblivious to the quiet force who had just entered their orbit. He approached the polished reception desk where Lena Moritz, the senior lounge attendant, stood behind her computer. Lena had built her reputation over 16 years as a gatekeeper, one who could spot a VIP from 20 feet away. At 44, tall and impeccably styled, she carried herself with the clipped confidence of someone who knew the rules and expected them to be followed. Calvin handed over his boarding pass with a nod. "Good afternoon," he said softly. Lena barely glanced up, her eyes flickering to the pass before narrowing. She frowned. "Sir, this lounge is for first-class passengers only. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Calvin's smile was patient, if firm. "Could you double-check that, please?" With a theatrical sigh, Lena scanned the barcode. "Sir, I've done this job long enough to recognize a fake when I see one. And this," she waved the pass in front of her face, "is obviously not valid." Then, before he could respond, she tore it cleanly in half. The rip echoed through the room like a gunshot. Heads turned. A young man across the room started filming with his phone. Murmurs bubbled up from the pristine white armchairs. Calvin's expression never changed. "Miss Moritz," he said evenly, "that ticket was issued by Horizon Air's executive office. Please call and verify." "Security will be called if you don't leave," she snapped, dropping the shredded pass onto the counter like trash. That's when another voice whispered, "Wait, did she just rip up the chairman's ticket?" The words spread like a shockwave. Phones tilted toward Calvin, whose calm was now taking on a different shade, still silent, but unmistakably powerful. He reached into his jacket and dialed. "Ben," he said, not raising his voice. "Yes, go ahead and make the press announcement. And push up the acquisition timeline by 24 hours. Lena paled. Calvin ended the call, placed his phone gently back into his jacket, and looked directly at her. "You made a judgment based on appearance," he said quietly. "But appearances can be misleading." He turned and walked away from the desk. The lounge was dead silent. He found a chair by the window and sat, adjusting the cuffs of his jacket. Beyond the glass, jets coasted slowly across the tarmac. Inside, Lena stood frozen, lips parted in stunned disbelief. Calvin didn't move, didn't gloat. He simply watched the sun rise over the edge of the runway. He had planned to stay anonymous that morning, to observe the airline he had just purchased from a passenger's perspective. But now, the decision had been made for him. There was no hiding the truth anymore, not with dozens of witnesses and a story that would surely go viral. Back in his hotel suite the night before, Calvin had finalized the $1.2 billion acquisition of Horizon Air. No fanfare, no public statements, just a quietly signed contract, a confidential email to his board, and a silent vow to rebuild the airline from the ground up with fairness and integrity as its foundation. Born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1955, Calvin had seen firsthand what it meant to be underestimated. He'd grown up under the lingering cloud of segregation, joined the U.S. Air Force at 18, and become one of the first black pilots in his division. His call sign Falcon was whispered with respect after 130 combat missions, each flown with razor precision. He'd earned the Distinguished Flying Cross, not that he ever talked about it. After retiring from the military, he spent 3 decades in private investment, never flashy, never loud, but always deliberate. He focused on empowering veteran-led businesses and quietly funded scholarships for underrepresented youth in aviation. It was at a charity gala when he first heard the idea that planted the seed. A retired Horizon mechanic had leaned across a table, chuckling bitterly. "You know," he'd said, "those lounges treat you like royalty till they see your face." Calvin had smiled politely at the time. But the next morning, he began the first steps to buy the very company that Mechanic had worked for. Now, sitting in a lounge, he was the invisible force behind Horizon Air. And Amanda's actions tearing his ticket, dismissing his presence had become a case study in everything he aimed to change. The flight was called. Calvin rose with quiet dignity, his briefcase swinging gently at his side. He walked to gate 22, handed the replacement pass to the gate agent, and boarded the aircraft without a word. In seat 1A, he settled in. Across from him, Amanda walked down the aisle with a beverage cart, her eyes skimming past him until she caught the glint of the military pin on his collar. Her face flushed, hands trembling as she poured champagne for the man next to him. She skipped Calvin entirely. A woman across the aisle noticed. "Excuse me," she whispered. "Is he not getting service?" "I'll wait," Calvin said simply. The entire first-class cabin watched as Amanda ignored him again. Behind her, another attendant leaned toward her. "That's the chairman," she murmured. "He owns Horizon." Amanda froze. Calvin said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence was louder than any rebuke. The moment had already passed, and she had missed it. After takeoff, he pulled out a gold-trimmed envelope and reviewed the internal training directive inside. Bias awareness, staff evaluations, service metrics rooted in equity. As the flight descended into Atlanta, Amanda offered him water at last. Calvin accepted with a nod. No bitterness. No anger. Just a quiet reminder. Dignity doesn't shout. It doesn't need to. It simply waits to be seen. And when they landed and passengers gathered near the exit, Horizon CEO met Calvin at the door. "We're ready for your press conference," he said. Calvin nodded. "Let's make this right." In the conference room, he outlined sweeping changes. Mandatory training. Departmental reviews. A new culture. Meanwhile, Amanda was placed on leave. But Calvin didn't stop there. He requested she be offered a chance not to keep her job, but to lead the internal training she had once needed herself. Her mistake could become her redemption. Later that year, Calvin sat with a group of new hires, sharing stories from his time in the cockpit. He spoke of near misses, discipline, teamwork. But most of all, he spoke of respect, of the power in restraint, of leading with integrity, even when no one's watching. And as the sun set over Atlanta, a Horizon jet lifted into the sky, its flight crew newly trained, its policies rewritten, and its chairman quietly watching for the terminal proof that real change doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks calmly into a lounge, is mistaken for less, and waits. Because justice, when it finally lands, always finds its gate.